protection of birds has said it has not ruled out direct action from defending nature from the government's key growth policies that could damage wildlife.
Yes, but where has this inspiration come from? Does protesting get the message across, or does it have the opposite effect? Well, joining us now is Rupert Reid, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He's also an author and former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. Really appreciate your time this morning. Is there any evidence that direct action actually works in persuading the public, persuading the government of causes?
Well, yeah, the evidence is pretty straightforward. So if you look at history, the suffragettes, if you look at the civil rights movement in the US, Gandhi, Indian independence movement, they all used nonviolent direct action and they all won, and they are all now perceived as obviously legitimate and correct. If you look back at Extinction Rebellion, it's very clear that Extinction Rebellion got the issue of climate into people's consciousness and into the news in a way that had never happened before in the first rebellion in 2019. And if you look at the latest development here, the RSPB saying now that government policy is so extreme that they won't rule out taking nonviolent direct action. Well, I don't watch GB News all the time, but it is the first time I've heard the RSPB mentioned actually on GB News. So it seems that direct action does work even before you even do it in terms of getting the attention of the media. And I would say to the media, obviously the media, GB News, whoever, are going to be interested in direct action, but it's also very important to pay attention to the concerns of groups before they feel they have to resort to nonviolent direct action. It would have been great to have heard more about the RSPB's completely legitimate objections to this government's extreme policies against nature before they said they would be willing to undertake nonviolent direct action to stop it.
Well, Rupert, I mean, you mentioned, direct action in relation to the suffragettes and other important movements throughout history. But many people would say that Extinction Rebellion and many of these activists are not comparable to those movements, and is actually an insult to the genuine struggles for human dignity and respect that many of those other movements actually forwarded. In fact, some people would argue that Extinction Rebellion have a much more negative view of human beings. They prioritise nature and the environment over perhaps the economic prosperity, the economic development of human beings. So in that sense, is it really right to make that kind of comparison? Because actually what it seems that this direct action only really frustrates the public and alienates them from your cause.
Well, there's a number of things there. Let's start with the point about prioritising nature. Anyone who thinks that nature isn't very important, I'd invite them to see how long you can live while holding your breath and eating money. What the RSPB are saying here is that nature is under such threat that they, an incredibly moderate organisation, are now being forced to consider nonviolent direct action. And why are they doing it? They're doing it because it works and because they're desperate. And when people are desperate, they will resort to these kinds of measures. Now, in terms of Extinction Rebellion, I'm not part of Extinction Rebellion anymore. I have no dog in this fight. But if we look back at history, as I say, then what is very clear is that whenever these movements come along, people always say, oh, you're extreme, you're going to alienate people. That is exactly what people said to the suffragettes, to the civil rights movement, and so forth. So, of course, it's no surprise that you and others are saying the exact same thing now against people like Extinction Rebellion. But what Extinction Rebellion are trying to do, it's worth trying to empathize with why people like Extinction Rebellion, or Just Stop Oil, or now the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, get driven to this kind of situation. The reason they get driven to it, as I say, is because they are desperate and because other avenues have not worked. And with Extinction Rebellion in 2019, it was very clear that it worked in the sense that public consciousness on climate and on nature changed permanently. And people in opinion polls after the rebellion said they didn't necessarily like XR very much. But what they said is, yes, we now understand how much of an emergency this is, how much of an existential
you say
threat
that you say that
is,
because you say the government is pursuing extreme policies and not listening to you. But I mean, for a lot of people, that is completely the opposite of what they've seen. I mean, we were at the top of the COP26. You know, we had the climate secretary Alok Sharma. You know, he was crying and actually arguing more than perhaps any other country for strong action on net zero. So this idea that this country or the leadership historically have been behind or extreme doesn't really seem to be what has transpired the last few years.
Well, let's turn to why the RSPB are doing what they're doing. Why is this incredibly moderate organisation now saying we're thinking of doing the same kind of thing as Extinction Rebellion did? It is because this government, which of course is unelected, it's got no manifesto legitimacy for what it's trying to do, is threatening to rip up all the fundamental protections that nature, including birds in this country, has. And that is why the RSPB and the National Trust and the Wildlife Trust, all these incredibly moderate organisations, are now absolutely furious because we have an extreme government with no legitimacy tearing these things up. Now, turning specifically to climate, this government is saying that they're going to go even further than previous governments in ripping up the protections that we have. They're saying we're going to drill for oil all over the place. We're going to have fracking in this country, which if it happened, would devastate our country for no discernible benefit. And going back to the Boris Johnson government, I mean, that was already a really terrible government on these fronts, because although it's true that Boris Johnson and Alok Sharma talked a good talk, let's look at their walk. You have to look at what people actually do. And the Conservative government was already planning to start new coal mining in this country. Just let me finish, please. Was already planning to start new coal mining in this country.